Thank you for joining us to celebrate the distinguished 2020 Drue Heinz Literature Prize winner, Caroline Kim, and the publication of her prize-winning book, The Prince of Mournful Thoughts and Other Stories. Hello, I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. Welcome. This program is part of our Made Local series, produced in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Thank you to the library and to the University of Pittsburgh Press, the steward of the Drue Heinz Prize and the publisher of this wonderful book, and to White Whale Bookstore, where you can purchase a copy of Caroline's book. Caroline Kim has an MFA in poetry from the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award. She has an MA in fiction from the University of Texas at Austin, where she was a James Michener Fellow. We are thrilled that Caroline Kim will read from her work, followed by the judge of this year's prize, acclaimed novelist and essayist Alexander Chee. The readings will be followed by their conversation. Now, with a few words about Caroline's book and the Drue Heinz Prize, please welcome University of Pittsburgh Press publicist Chloe Wertz. Chloe?
Hello. Thank you for joining us to celebrate our winner of the 2020 Drue Heinz Literature Prize, Caroline Kim, and her captivating short story collection, The Prince of Mournful Thoughts and Other Stories. This collection took nearly 2 decades to come together. Caroline Kim, quote, "In my late 20s, I realized that though I felt Korean to my core, I had no idea what that meant. I wanted to read stories about what I felt was missing for myself, stories about Korea, and what it was like in the past and during the war. I also yearned for stories where the point of view came from a person like me, Korean, American, middle-aged, a mother, an immigrant, an outsider. I took courses in the Korean language, visited Korea, and read about its history and politics, as well as the fiction translated into English, and watched countless hours of Korean historical dramas. Along the way, I wrote a story every few years." I'm Chloe Wertz, the publicist at the University of Pittsburgh Press. On behalf of the press, I'd like to thank Stephanie Flom, Lisa Christopher, and the talented staff at Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures for hosting Caroline Kim and this prestigious prize. We are grateful to Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures for their support of our Drue Heinz Prize over the years. I'd also like to thank our friends at White Whale Bookstore, the official independent book retailer for Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. I would like to extend my gratitude to the award-winning author Alexander Chee for being our guest judge and joining us for this special reading and Q&A. The Drue Heinz Literature Prize recognizes and supports writers of short fiction and makes their work available to readers around the world. Winners receive a cash prize of $15,000, publication by the University of Pittsburgh Press, and support in the nationwide promotion of their book. Please enjoy this reading from Alexander Chee and Caroline Kim, followed by a Q&A led by me and the press's marketing director, John Fagan. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to start out by thanking the Drue Heinz Foundation, the University of Pittsburgh Press, and especially Alexander Chee. Prizes like this are essential for getting collections of short stories out into the world, and I'm extremely grateful to have won this prize. I'll be reading an abridged version of the story, Picasso's Blue Period. There's a picture of my daughter's house of a man wearing a black overcoat and standing against a blue wall. His hair is the same black as his heavy coat, and he has a wide forehead, a face that is pale and angular with blue shadows beneath his dark eyes, a smudge of mustache that curves down around his unhappy mouth. It is a sad face, an empty face. Why does my daughter hang a picture of this man in her house? In the upper left corner in white letters is printed his name, Pablo Picasso, and the name of the museum in Paris where the original of this painting hangs. The letters are so small that I've had to nearly press my nose into the glass frame in order to read them. When I ask my daughter about this painting, she tells me that she acquired it during her honeymoon in Paris, at the very museum where the original now hangs. In fact, she and my son-in-law saw the original for themselves and liked it so much that they wanted a reproduction. She said it cost them $25. $25 seems like a lot of money for a picture of a lonely man staring at you while you are eating dinner. This is the first time I have seen this picture. I have not seen my daughter since her marriage last year. I am alone in my daughter's house, so I can stare at this picture as long as I choose. I do not like this man, but he interests me very much. My daughter has told me that it is a self-portrait, that the artist Picasso painted the man Picasso, a cold, closed individual. It is a curious thing. The more I stare at this portrait, the more I look into his eyes, the more I begin to feel that he has begun to stare back at me. It is as though I am the painting, and he is the man standing in my daughter's dining room. It gives me a strange sensation. I hurry into the warmth of the living room, into the golden gleam of the floors reflecting the afternoon light. I turn on the television to a baseball game. The voices of the announcers are soothingly ordinary. Now that I am an old man, I begin to lose myself in things. My wife and daughter have disappeared deeper into the suburbs for a morning of shopping. My daughter is pregnant with her first child, and they are out looking for more baby things. What more can a baby need, I ask my wife, who is overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandparent. I am as well, of course. It is an unspeakably wonderful feeling to be awaiting the birth of a grandchild. Because we are in California, the game being televised is the San Francisco Giants versus the Yankees. The Giants are winning and the pitchers are walking Barry Bonds every time he is up at bat, fearing another home run out of the park and into the ocean. My son-in-law has told me that people wait in their boats with their radios, hoping to catch a ball hit by Barry Bonds. Sometimes they do. I do not particularly care about the outcome, except that I am always happy to see the Yankees lose. They are the enemy of my favorite team, the Red Sox. My favorite because Boston was my first home in America 23 years ago. My daughter then was only 12 and my son was 9. I was 42 and my wife 38. For a long time, there was nothing but work. We moved out to the suburbs where my wife and I worked in a factory making and testing computer chips. For a long time, I handled the chemicals with which they coated the chips, foul-smelling liquids with long names that I could not pronounce and that I have now happily forgotten. We wore goggles and masks and thick, heavy gloves that grew black from the residue of the chemicals. Sometimes I had terrible headaches that made the world go dark, and I would lie in bed and try to block out all thought. I pressed my mind to see only images of mountain streams and forests of cool green shadows, but I could only see blue, a shadowy gray blue, like the lonely hour after the sun goes down. Perhaps that is it. There is something about the man in the picture that recalls those times to me. Later, some of the men I worked with developed terrible cancers of the liver, stomach, prostate, and lungs, but nobody could prove that it was due to the chemicals we worked with. So far, I am one of the lucky ones. Although the headaches have grown worse so that I am nearly blinded by them for one whole day or longer, I am still alive. In our third year of working at this factory of cancers, my wife grew sick. Green from the growth inside her, she threw up several times a day. At first, I was relieved when the doctor told us that she was only with child. It meant that I would not lose her, my only companion, she who bore our fate with steely cheerfulness. But another child was impossible. What little money we had was reserved for our 2 others, for food and clothes, and for the schools that would offer them the prospect of better lives, jobs that would not endanger their health. For 2 weeks we vacillated. At night we held each other, fear suffocating us. What hope was there for us? My wife would have to leave her job, the paycheck that made it possible for us to exist. Who would take care of the baby? My sister, our closest family member, lived more than 2 hours away. In the end, it was I who made the decision. I could not burden her with it, though she suffered. It was I who failed to make enough money, I who lacked the vision, the ambition to create fortune where there was none. I who had turned my back on the chance to go into partnership with a man who now owned several prime properties back where we had come from. I had committed the crime of timidity. One Friday, we both called in sick to our supervisors. A sudden cold, we said, aching and fever in our bodies. We drove to a clinic one town over, a flat box of a building, undecorated and anonymous. Inside, they had tried to make it look like someone's home, with donated couches and mismatched lamps and a TV broadcasting a daytime drama. We gave our names to a smiling young woman who led my wife away. Just as they reached a closed door, my wife turned, then returned to me. "Hold this," she said, giving me her handbag. I reached a hand out to touch her, but failed in midair. I nodded. She gave me an unreadable stare and then turned her back on me. I sat on a striped couch, gone so soft with wear I feared I would never escape it. There were several other women and 2 men. We did not look at each other, our eyes riveted to the TV screen. After several minutes, the young man with longish hair cleared his throat and asked aloud if it would be okay to change the channel. Nobody said a word. In a jerky movement, he rose and turned the knob until he found an afternoon baseball game. The Red Sox were winning. It's a little later in the afternoon, and he gets a phone call. "It is my wife. I sense at once that something is wrong." "We are at the hospital," my wife says. "The baby may come sooner than we expected." "What happened?" She thought it was indigestion, but the pain only grew worse. There was some bleeding, but now the doctor says everything is fine. "David has already left to pick you up." "Is that normal?" I ask. "What is normal when one is having a baby?" she says. "God willing, we will have a granddaughter before the evening is through," my wife says, before hanging up. As I walk through the dining room, I stop to tell Picasso that my daughter is giving birth. He stares back at me as if to say, "And so?" 20 minutes later, my son-in-law returns home. He is understandably preoccupied. I can hear him moving with great urgency upstairs, where he has gone to pack a small suitcase for my daughter. In the kitchen, where I am waiting with my overcoat and camera at the table, he stops to drink a glass of water in great gulps like a man who has been in the desert for some time. Also, like a man in the desert, there is a faraway look in his eyes. I know this feeling of anticipation, the longing and fear of what is about to take place. Sometimes I think it is easier for women who for the past 9 months have undergone a physical transformation. Their bodies have told them of what is to come as they have lived with a new life inside them. For men, it can be a sudden, violent change, and though you think you are prepared, you are not. So they set out for the hospital and immediately encounter some Bay Area traffic. And David takes the opportunity to call his wife and find out what's happening. "The traffic is terrible," he tells her. "Yes, he's here. He's fine." Yes, I've got everything. The magazines, the lotions, your nightgown. Yes. Does it hurt? Has the bleeding stopped? You're sure? And afterward? We'll be there as soon as we can. I love you. He hangs up. He swings into another lane of traffic. I'm a little embarrassed. The life between a husband and wife is an intimate thing. It should not be exposed to outsiders. But of course, Americans find it easy to declare their love for each other. I love you, they all say, but they manage to divorce each other several years later. I've never told my wife that I love her, and I've never heard it from her. It is unnecessary. It would be like saying I breathe, or I think, or I love. But my daughter's lucky to have found a good man, a man who vacuums and cooks and rubs her feet at the end of the day. I have seen this for myself. Their marriage is of a different generation. Sometimes I think my wife wishes she were of a different generation herself. But when I try to do the dishes or wipe the table after a spill, she laughs at me or scowls and says that I am not doing it correctly. How can one wipe a table incorrectly, I ask her. I don't know, she says, but you are inventing it. They get to the hospital and it seems like his daughter is fine. He's really impressed with the room and how she's hooked up to all these various machines. I'm sitting with my wife on a small couch when a loud, insisting beeping erupts from one of the machines. We watch it as if it were a television. What's that? David says. A nurse rushes in, pushes a button that silences a short burst of sound, and examines the long roll of paper that is coming from the machine. Sounds like the baby's heartbeat has dipped a little, she says, patting my daughter's hand. She picks up the phone and asks for a doctor with a foreign-sounding name. She says to my daughter, let's just take a look, and pulls back the bed sheets. It is startling. At first, I think there must be a mistake. Why would they put red sheets on the bed? But then I see that it is blood. There are dark clots of it. It is many colors, many shades of red and black. My daughter screams. David is shouting something I don't understand. My wife rushes to my daughter and tries to unfold her. Several people have swept into the room and are unhooking my daughter from the machines, putting a needle into her arm. It is like being in the middle of a tornado, so much flying movement and myself so still. My mind has gone useless and I stand like a shadow of a man until David shouts at me, "Pull her off." I wake. I grab my wife's arms, pull her to me so that the doctor and nurses can lift my daughter onto another bed and wheel her away. David runs alongside them, shouting my daughter's name. Then begins the long waiting. I think of the worst that could happen. I must prepare for it. I imagine the death of the baby, the death of my daughter. I see the three of us departing the hospital alone, leaving my daughter behind. It will be sunny and bright, and we will have to blink many times and squint in order to see anything. It will be the first day without her, and it will be unbearable. I must try to know this pain before it comes to fell me. And then at this point, he has a memory of when his daughter was 2, and she came down with a mysterious illness, and at that time, too, they were afraid of losing her. We took her to the hospital, but they could not tell us what was wrong. They tried one test after another, put needles and tubes into her tiny arms and hands, and still the fever continued. At first I promised God and Buddha that I would stop drinking, but as the days passed, it became more and more difficult to fulfill. On the 6th night, I weakened and went to see a friend. We went to a roadside bar to eat sausages and drink many bowls of makgeolli. The sweet, cloudy drink ran slowly down the inside of my body like a river of milk. I tried to stay in that state for as long as I could. But like always, I tipped the scales a little too far to one side and toppled. My friend put me in the back of a taxi and told the driver where I lived. That same night, my daughter started to convulse. My wife tied her to her back and ran to the acupuncturist. She said my daughter weighed nothing, but emanated a heat that was scorching, that made water run down the sides of her face and wet her back. She remembered concentrating on listening to my daughter breathe. It was so slow and shallow. The acupuncturist, an old woman with strongly veined hands, laid her on a small bed and slowly put thin needles into her arms, her legs, her stomach, and the tiny lobes of her ears. My wife thought a child that young would fight the small pricklings, would buck up and flail at such adult foolishness. But my daughter lay there quite still and looked at her as though none of this was happening. The old woman put one last needle between her eyebrows and told my wife she would sleep, and she did. The old woman said my daughter had a hot wind in her that needed release, that a great battle was occurring inside her, that she only looked quiet, but was fighting. When my daughter woke an hour later, the old woman said my wife could take her home. She said it would pass. And where was I? Sleeping like a fool. When I woke, we argued. I wanted to bring her back to the hospital. I felt sure the old woman had failed. But my wife, with the strength I did not know she possessed, said I could go where I wanted, but she and the baby were staying home. The fever broke, and by mid-morning, my daughter was sitting up and eating and watching Woody Woodpecker on television. Suddenly, I stand. I clench and unclench my fists. I feel the deepest urgency to run, to find my daughter, to put the blood back in her, to carry her on my back to someone who can help her. I need to remind her to fight. I walk quickly to the door where my wife stares at me, but when I look down the gleaming hall, I don't know in what direction to turn. Every door is the same, closed to me. I stand in the hallway until I'm asked to make room for a bed to go by, a wife holding her husband's hand. Earlier, the nurse told us that what my daughter suffered was called placental abruption, that while it is serious, she was lucky to have been close to the hospital. My wife gripped my elbow the whole time the nurse was talking, and I told her afterward that everything would be fine, but I did not believe it. That is why I'm standing in the hallway. I am a father. I must let her know how much I need her to live. How foolish I am. Then I see a figure walking toward me, made dark by the setting sun from the window behind him, and I see it is David. David, in thin blue hospital clothes, walking toward me, his arms outstretched. He is smiling. Tatiana Hano Lewis is born at 7:35 p.m., weighing 7 inches, weighing 7 pounds, 10 ounces. She has black hair waving 2 inches high. As I hold her bundled form, she pinches and changes her face in many different ways, going through too many emotions at once. I know how she feels. My wife hovers nearby, her body a beam of light, scolding me to hold her securely. I tell her my arms are made of iron and steel, and indeed they feel as if they were fashioned just for this purpose. My wife proclaims her a beauty. The baby struggles and opens one eye, the other sealed shut with mucus. She stares up at me with one brown eye as if she knows me already. I fill with pride when my daughter says she looks like me. Yes, you have an old man's face, I tell her, silently. I've waited many years for you. A week later, while everyone is asleep, I wake. As I pass from the dining room to the kitchen for a glass of water, I stop before the picture of the man in the black overcoat. I stand there while the light in the room advances from blue to pink with the rising sun, and I begin to see what was always there to be seen, that the man in the picture is not cruel. He is merely holding on to some sadness. We cannot erase the past, I tell him, but we can add happiness upon happiness until it no longer hurts us. That long ago day after we left the clinic, my wife told me that she did not wish to go home. A neighbor, an immigrant like us, but from Iran, was watching over our children. I asked my wife if she was hungry or thirsty, that we could go to a restaurant, but she said no, only drive away. So I drove slowly through the streets of our town, around the rotary with the statue of Lafayette triumphant on his horse, now badly scarred by terrible words and haphazard paint, and along the Merrimack River, where the little wooden cottages were nearly sliding into the water. We parked at a small turnabout where I have sometimes seen children and old men fishing. The water through the trees was brown and slow-moving and impenetrable. I'm sorry, I said. For a time she said nothing. Then she said, it's curious that one speaks of loss when someone dies. It isn't loss at all. She turned to me, her face bright and shiny. It is a weight that must be held, must be carried. It lives while we live, and that is all right. It will get easier, I said. Perhaps, she said. We sat for some time watching the water, aware of the occasional bird disturbing the leaves on the trees. From high up, another bird called and was answered. I held my wife's hand tightly, too tightly, until I could feel it beating, beating, beating to the rhythm of my own heart. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alexander Chee, and today I'm reading to you from a manuscript of mine that is a novel that began as a collection of stories, and which I chose to honor Caroline with because it is about a Korean-American gay man named Jack Cho, and I've been writing about him for about 15 or 20 years. Sometimes these books take a while. The 2 weddings Jack and Caleb attended in the first year they were together would each become stories they told again and again in the years to come, until the weddings came to seem like visitors at the cradle of their own relationship, conferring gifts and wisdom, and not at all like the awkwardly human social events they had once been. The first wedding had been for 2 friends of Caleb's, 2 white gay men who had been together 10 years, able to marry at last. In a Catskills campground rented for the ceremony weeks after the Supreme Court ruling, the couple declared their handwritten vows to each other in front of a massive wooden bear carved by a chainsaw, a gold necklace with the word love hanging from its neck, and a bouquet tied to each paw. Each groom threw one to the crowd after they were married. The happy couple drove off in a vintage Corvette convertible, strings of cans clanking as they left, and then drove back, horns honking, to the laughter of the assembled group, and the celebration began. The party lasted well into the morning. The ceremony was intimate and funny, and full of people who had all known each other a long time, except for Jack, but everyone treated him as if he had always been there. This was Jack's first gay wedding somehow, and while it was perhaps the most fun wedding he'd ever been to, Jack also knew that as Caleb's plus one, he was being scrutinized carefully by Caleb's friends, in some new way he never had been before, as a possible husband. They joked about his suitability for Caleb, and at some point he understood this was what it was like for his straight friends, what it had always been like. While no previous boyfriend of Jack's had ever bothered with the question of whether Jack might be suitable to marry, at least that Jack knew of, Jack had never asked this question about them either. And that he was now getting this treatment because it was the first year of federal marriage, this felt almost ominous. At age 42, he felt as if he had moved to another country while staying in the same place. What was a federal gay marriage like? If this was any example, it involved a wedding with line dancing, a glitter cannon, frosé, cheeseburgers served at midnight, and then afterward everyone got high around a campfire and wandered back to their rented cabins, mostly with the people they came with. There had been 2 stag parties that became one as the strippers hired for the weekend led each groom to the other, symbolic of the night they'd met at a club with go-go dancers. And the strippers were friends of the couple and a couple themselves, recently married, as he learned at the reception. There was rehearsal night karaoke with Caleb absolutely nailing Hot Child in the City, and Jack receiving much applause for Over the Rainbow, sung with a recklessly improvised falsetto that made him a hero to many there. As the assembled group congratulated him, Jack understood he was at last inside a story like the ones he'd been seeing in the newspapers. Stories of long-time queer couples marrying after many years together, the ordinary heterosexual marriages on the vows pages, describing couples who'd met a year or 2 previous, now seemed too abrupt, unions made hastily. Jack did have another mission, if a quiet one. It was almost as simple as, how many Asian American friends does Caleb have? But in fact, it was more complex than that. Jack had put Caleb through a protocol he hadn't described for him. He checked his photos for past Asian American boyfriends, one, also Korean, like Jack, checked his friends group for other people of color, many. He had only ever dated a bona fide rice queen once, and he never wanted to make that mistake again. That someone might like you just for your ethnicity was its own violence, but the diverse crowd of celebrants reassured him that what he wanted to believe about Caleb was true, and so he let this fear go. By the time Caleb fell asleep on Jack in an Adirondack chair at the reception, Jack was entirely enchanted by the idea of marrying Caleb in particular. They had been sitting talking about something Jack no longer remembers. He sipped at his drink in a careful way so as not to rouse Caleb, content to watch him sleep. It was even suspenseful. Caleb had a full glass in his hand and hadn't dropped it the whole time, which both impressed and moved him. In the first minutes, he imagined Caleb to be awake, still in order to hold the glass. He was simply enjoying the contact of their bodies like Jack was. The bright line of it was like if you could feel the first light of dawn in the space between 2 people. But Caleb was truly asleep, and once Jack knew this, he stayed put. Besides, the line had become richer, and the bright scene grew to be a river of light and warmth. Waking him meant interrupting this, and Jack wanted to go wherever this river was taking him. A secret he had not yet admitted to Caleb. It felt healing to be pressed against him, as if some wound he never knew he had healed itself more each time they touched. "This is so adorable," a woman friend of the newlyweds who danced with them earlier said as she passed by. He nodded, and she winked. But Caleb didn't feel that way when he woke up. "Why didn't you wake me?" he asked Jack. He felt a little betrayed, even a little embarrassed that the other guests had been dancing around him while he slept. "I like watching you sleep," Jack said. "That's creepy," Caleb said, frowning, and then he took a sip from his carefully held glass of wine, giving him a look of mixed suspicion and affection. "Cheers." Much of what Jack found charming about the wedding, when they compared notes the next morning, put Caleb on edge. Caleb, Jack discovered, was a monogamist who was also against marriage, but Caleb eventually admitted In the car back to New York, he was at least intrigued by the way the wedding was so intimately a product of the couple's lives. The conversation about marriage, the seemingly inevitable byproduct of attending one together, began, and it would continue over the years. Caleb's passing compliment about the quality of his friend's nuptials was enough for Jack to keep feeling something like the hope of getting married to Caleb, even though he had said in the same conversation that he didn't want to marry. And yet, the feeling of wanting to marry someone was so unfamiliar, it was terrifying. And so he pushed it into a little box behind his heart for 2 months, and he kept it there until this next wedding invitation arrived from Scott, when he took it out again. Scott was Jack's white friend from college, most likely to end up in a Korean wedding ceremony. He had dated a series of Asian women for his entire life, as if auditioning them for a role, and most of them were Korean. He called Jack personally from his office in Palo Alto with the news that he was going to be married at last. Would Jack come? And of course he could bring someone. Jack said yes and thanked him before he could stop himself. He recalled that the last time they'd seen each other, Scott, who worked in private equity, had just begun dating his bride-to-be, Sunmi, another private equity fund partner from a different fund. They'd met on a deal. She was a Korean-American woman from the suburbs near Niagara Falls. The wedding would be there and last a weekend. There was to be a Korean ceremony and a Western one, and Scott expressly hoped Jack would be there for the Korean ceremony. As he was, as he put it, my first Korean friend. I have to carry my mother-in-law on my back, Scott said and laughed knowingly, as if of course Jack knew he'd have to do this, though Jack did not in fact know this. Jack's mother and father had never spoken to him, not once, about how Koreans married, and his siblings had both chosen to marry in a Western way, without once seeming to consider a traditional Korean wedding. It had never come up. He had come out to them at an early age, and so maybe they decided he didn't need to know, but this was the sort of guessing he was used to doing with his parents, who had emigrated in the 1960s and were more committed to assimilation than later generations. They tended to treat their Korean heritage like they were in the witness protection program and could never speak of their country of origin, at least not in any detail to anyone who didn't already know about it, their children included. This had meant he felt uncomfortable even asking questions about Korean culture, and the resulting silence was something he still didn't know how to break for the way that it had grown up around him. He wondered what they'd think of this split ceremony and hoped to tell them about it after he'd seen it. After he and Scott said goodbye, he stared at the phone in his hand as if it had betrayed him. This invitation had startled Jack. He and Scott had been repairing their friendship slowly for years, and then just kind of stopped. It had been almost 2 years since he'd heard from Scott, and Jack's understanding was that nothing was wrong. They had just become very different people, and there was almost no way to explain that, and also no need. But then, why had he said yes? He texted Caleb, "Do you want to go to another wedding? They'd had so much fun at the last one. It was almost a promise of new fun." "Okay, fine," Caleb wrote back. "Who is it?" Early in their relationship, Jack and Caleb had completed what Jack thought of as their gay family tree, naming their serious boyfriends and first loves and telling some of their stories. But Scott was like a secret Jack had only half told to himself, outside of any ordinary recount. There was a story Jack usually told about Scott, when he did, and it was in no way going to be sufficient for Caleb, and it would not explain why he had accepted the invitation or invited Caleb. It would only create more questions. At the time Jack met Scott on the novice crew team, he was unlike anyone he'd ever met. Most of the team didn't have much muscle when they began, but Scott did. He wore gold wire-rimmed glasses, liked listening to Def Leppard, played Dungeons & Dragons, often argued the conservative position in disagreements about politics, and wore pleated pants. A giant nerd with a radiant boy-next-door sexiness, his button nose was the kind people would bring a photo of to their plastic surgeon, and the tan line at his waist would flash as his shirt rode up front and back in ways Jack has never forgotten. They rode bow seat and two seat, and Scott, technically shorter by an inch, sat behind him. But there was something else that set him apart. "I feel Korean inside," he told Jack early into their friendship, which had made Jack so confused it was almost easier to just accept it. They laughed together the first time he said it, as if at a shared joke. Even as Jack struggled with the questions he didn't even know how to ask himself. Had he himself ever felt Korean inside, for example? How would he know? Wouldn't it just feel like himself? Whatever he'd felt, it was probably not what Scott felt. But also he was Korean American, not Korean, a distinction he had never really been able to explain sufficiently to the white people in his life so far. But then again, he had never met anyone white who had also asked, or was even this interested in Koreans, much less someone who wanted to become one. In Maine, where he was from, most of the white people his own age in the 1970s didn't even know how to pronounce Korea. Scott, meanwhile, behaved like someone preparing for citizenship, or more than that, really, preparing to leave not just his family, but also his culture, and never return. He knew more about Korean history than Jack did, and had studied Korean in high school, something Jack had avoided, as it usually meant going to the Korean Evangelical Church. This was a time when it was common for Koreans to treat Korean Americans like badly educated Koreans, and his conversations with Scott even reminded him a little of those encounters, hangouts awkwardly full of little lessons. He wanted to warn Scott off this plan, if that was what it was, but soon enough Jack discovered Scott was not so unique. He was just the first of a kind of white man Jack would meet more of, a type. Rice Queens were what gay men called men like this, and so when one of Scott's exes called him a Rice King to Jack, he could never forget it. By the time Jack might have defended himself against Scott, they were friends, and then, against his better judgment, roommates the next year. Scott favored long showers and would sit in their common area in a towel afterward, and Jack would burn each time he walked by, trying to pretend it was ordinary. He never got used to it. I'll stop there for now. Congratulations again to Caroline. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So before we begin, I want to congratulate Caroline Kim once again for winning our Drue Heinz Literature Prize. It's been a really wonderful joy to work with Caroline, and we're thrilled to get this heartfelt collection out into the world for readers to enjoy. I also want to thank Alexander Chee for joining us and being our guest judge for this year's prize. So actually, my first question is for Alex. Can you tell us a little bit about the judging process for Drue Heinz and what sort of initially stood out for you about Caroline's manuscript?
So the judging process is an interesting one because I think most people feel like, and I think understandably, that contests could be arbitrary, or that that taste is also, and I would argue that when you are judging something like this, that is incumbent on you to think about things that I think some people may find interesting. I hope, at least. I tried to, in looking at the collections first as a group, to think about what was the artistry that really impressed me and why. And then also to think about, on balance, which collections had the most successful stories in them. And by most, I mean like where I felt like the majority, if not all, were truly successful stories, and not what my former teacher, Dennis Johnson, would call filler. That he, I remember when he was advising us on like, how do you put together a short story collection? And he was answering the question. Someone had posed it to him, and he said, "Well, you start with like few exciting ones, you put the best ones in the middle, and then you like put the filler in between. And I was like, no book of yours resembles that. He had just produced, I was in class with him in 1994. Jesus' Son had just come out. So it was surreal for me to think, like, do you really think any of those stories are filler?
Yeah, sure.
Because from where I was sitting as a reader, that was not the case. So I think, you also look to see if anyone is doing something across stories that is interesting. You look for a sense of any kind of consistent writerly sensibility. And, the thing that stood out to me about this manuscript was the way it met so many of those marks for me in terms of how much I enjoyed the stories, both individually and also a collective kind of sensibility that I felt emerging from them, which seemed to me to be an utterly unique approach to what I think of as the Korean diaspora, which I think a lot of us think of it as. And it's, something that I have been thinking about more and more in my own work. And so, in a sense, what I found in Caroline's book was a book that I had never seen before, a book that wasn't like anything that I can think of. And so I felt like I had kind of struck gold in that sense. I think lots of readers increasingly are aware of Korean culture in this climate where we have Min Jin Lee, who I understand is also a former judge for you, and the success of her, Tolstoyan novel Pachinko, which I think has really sort of reshaped American readers, such that I think these stories will find a particularly receptive climate also. That's my hope. Even as I think readers will learn more about this very diverse community. I mean, and that's the other thing too, is that the aesthetics in the story, I can see Carolyn as an artist pushing herself in several different directions. The title story alone is a masterpiece of historical fiction. I think, it was a clear standout.
Right. Yeah, something that she brought up in her notes as well was that when she was working on these stories, she was looking to write something that hadn't been written before that she wanted to read. And I think you made that clear also, how you struck gold. Great. So my next question is for Caroline. So in a brief Q&A that we did earlier this year when you first won the prize, and in the notes at the end of the collection, you write that you began to write this at a time when you were going through an identity crisis about what it meant to be Korean for you. And that really struck me because many of your characters wrestle with that, what preserving Koreanness means to them and how it affects their lives and their loved ones. So can you kind of expand on the way preserving identity informs your process?
Yeah, I love that question. Before I could really even think about preserving the culture, I had to figure out what my identity really was. And because of my experience of moving to America when I was 6 years old, and we ended up moving to a town in Massachusetts, very close to the New Hampshire border, that was very largely white. I think there was one other Asian family there, and they were Chinese. And it was just a very discombobulating experience to look a certain way, and because of the way you look, people would automatically have all these assumptions about you, that you could fluently speak the language, or that you knew this, you were so attached to this other place that you would know everything about the history and the culture. But my experience of it was so different because my parents at that time really wanted us to learn English because they felt like that was our way out, kind of moving up the ladder. So they really didn't encourage us to speak Korean. So they didn't send us to, Korean school. And at home, we largely spoke English, or we spoke some jumbled form of Korean and English. And so to look a certain way, but have so little understanding of what that place was such a discombobulating experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
Partly it made me feel dumb, like I didn't know any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then it just started to make me wonder, like, what does it even mean to be Korean? Like, what are there certain qualities that are very uniquely Korean? And I do think that does exist for different cultures and different countries. So I tried to figure out what those were. Was it from the foods they ate, the way they talked, the way they wrote their numbers? I noticed that all Koreans of my parents' age wrote their numbers exactly the same way. It was very strange,
Mm-hmm.
or the way that, people call each other. So in Korea, if they want you to call you over, they'll do this. Whereas in America, we do it like this. So when I went to Korea, I just immediately would stand out. So all of these things kind of got me to the point where I was already, this was in my mid-20s, I was already trying to write, but I hit a brick wall. And I realized the problem was I just didn't really have a great sense of my own identity. And so I decided to try to learn the language, try to read the history. And that was really, really difficult at first because I would read these Korean history books. And because all of my learning was Western, I learned certain Western structures of how the world was shaped and how it ran. And then I would read these history books and they would talk about bone rank hierarchies and things. And it was very hard for me to grasp. So I would go through these periods where I would read a bunch of history, not understand most of them. And then I would try to read all sorts of first person accounts. And, because I could only read in English, they were mostly written by Americans and British missionaries. So then I would try to read another history book again. And a little bit more would stick that time. So it was just a very long process of that.
Great.
Wow. Well, I have a question for you too, Caroline. In the story that you read, Picasso's Blue Period, the narrator is mourning the potential loss of his daughter and granddaughter, but already lives with so much sadness. Inherited sorrow is a recurring theme in your collection. How does sorrow complicate his relationship with his daughter, and how does sorrow restrict his language?
Yes. The way I think of that is that the sorrow comes because of the restrictions that the language barrier places between him and his daughter. So because they can only communicate very simply because they don't have much vocabulary that they can share, both their English words and the Korean words have to be very simple and basic. So in some ways, it can only communicate very basic wants and needs and emotions. And that's where the sorrow comes in, because they can't talk about the nuance and they can't share their experience because they just don't have the words for it. So it doesn't mean when their language barrier is there, it doesn't necessarily preclude love or emotion. I mean, they can love each other, but they can't really share each other's experiences. And that's very sad. And then also, just in Korean culture, I think the concept of inherited sorrow, there's the word han. I think, Alex, you know that too. And Korea has had a really complicated history because of its position between, three big powers, Russia, China, and Japan. So it's kind of always been open to attack and had to kind of fight for survival to keep its culture. And so there's a sense of never forget your past, never forget your history, pass it on just in case, just in case.
That's so interesting. There's a lot of countries, I think, in that position. when you were saying that, I was thinking of Poland in Europe. Definitely between everyone constantly overrun by others and a determination to keep its culture alive in the same way. So if you don't mind me making that comparison.
Yeah, no, and I feel that way about the Irish too.
Yes, right. Yeah,
I think they're really good about holding on to their culture too for that reason. I also think that's why they both drink a lot.
Which you bring up in one of the stories as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I have another question for you. The settings of these diverse stories take us from 18th century to Korea, to war-torn North Korea, and then from Minnesota to Paris and to Boston, and then to a futuristic San Francisco. Why was it important for you to tell these stories over various centuries and continents?
So after that, reading that Toni Morrison quote, write what the book that you want to read, I realized, oh, okay, that's a completely different way of writing stories than I've been thinking about. And when I really thought about it, I thought, God, I would love to read a story set during the Korean War. And I'm sure there are a lot written in Korean, but I didn't have access to them.
Right.
And I just hungered for that in English. And then also historical stories set in Korea. I really wanted to know what that would be like. And so I felt like, okay, like this is made me think of writing in a whole new way too. Like, this is fun. I could be the person that does this. And I know I've just always kind of imagined myself in different places and different times and as different people. And I think partly that comes from having grown up the way I did, like kind of Asian in a very white place where I one of the things I love is I love meeting new people, because I found that you could always connect with anyone at some level. And it was always easy for me to imagine being other people. And so it just seems kind of a natural extension of my interest to place my characters in different times and as different people.
That makes so much sense too, because also history does drive contemporary thought and action, even if it's an undercurrent as opposed to right on the page. So that's a really interesting answer, I think. It makes a lot of sense. This next question is for both Caroline and Alex. Caroline, this collection took 2 decades to come together, as I understand it anyway. And Alex, there was more than a decade between your first 2 novels, Edinburgh and The Queen of the Night. When you're working on a piece of writing for a long period of time, how do you stay engaged and excited by it? You want to go first, Caroline, and let Alex follow after you?
Okay. I had really stopped thinking about even having a book at some point. I was just struggling so much with writing my own stories and feeling like, before I read the Toni Morrison quote, kind of trying to fit my Korean experience into the stories I loved, I was struggling so much with that. They felt like such failures to me that I just couldn't see a book ever coming out of it. And then plus I had set myself these really kind of dumb expectations for myself. So after I graduated from my MFA program, I said, if I don't publish a book within 5 years or after 10 years, then I would quit. And I thought, well, if I can quit that easily, I should just quit. So I did quit, but it didn't really matter. I kept doing the same, like writing one story every 3 years. And after a while, I realized, okay, these are kind of accumulating. And around the same time, I'd noticed that my 2 older daughters, were becoming teenagers. And I realized that, they were hearing kind of a lot of platitudes. And I was saying some of them myself about how they could be whatever they wanted to be. And I felt like they didn't really see that from me necessarily. I mean, being a writer is really hard for other people to see. I don't have a desk or an office, so I write on my bed. So it just looked like I was hanging out in my bed a lot. I don't really think they knew what I was doing even. They weren't even really aware that I was writing. I just didn't really talk about that much. And I realized I don't really share with them this thing that I spend most of my time doing or thinking about. So I thought, you know what, it's time for me to start sending my work out. It's time for me that they see what putting effort in really looks like. And also that they see what rejection looks like and how you kind of keep going anywhere. I thought it would be like kind of a fun experiment to do it that way. And So I was really surprised. Like when I kind of came to that decision, then I started to work more diligently and put more focus on it. And then I started to see like, hey, I think this could be a book at some point.
It's interesting to think about the this idea of like, how do you stay interested? When I was working on The Queen of the Night, what I did do was I kept a journal that was specifically for the novel, where I would essentially, like at the end of the session of working, I would make an entry, list the sort of page range that I was working on, any questions I had about the story. I would vent frustrations that I had. Sometimes an entry would include something like, "Why does page 76 still suck?" It was a kind of sandbox of a sort to keep track of my own thinking about it, because once you get past a certain point of time, it is actually almost as if nothing is happening. So this idea that, that Carolyn put forward about how her daughters didn't see what she was doing is very acute to me, because my whole family was always treating me as if maybe I had nothing to do. Like maybe I could go take care of my mom while she was getting surgery, or maybe I could, drop everything to visit with a relative who was in town, or a family friend, etc. Because everyone else was too busy. Everyone else had to be at their offices. But me, what was I doing? I was just home. I could do anything. And I think, the essay collection I just put out those are essays from 25 years of writing. And in some ways, maybe it resembles the process that Caroline describes, where it's like you do these things over time and you don't realize maybe that they will all end up together. I essentially, realized that over the years that I'd been writing The Queen of the Night, I had also written, over 70 essays. And so I chose a group of them to include in a book, and a group that I had always left unfinished also. So there were essays in there that I've been working on really for like 20 years in some case, or sitting on really for 20 years. Working on is probably too strong a word for it.
Right.
Afraid of them for 20 years, or trying to figure out something that maybe I could have been more urgent about. So it was, I don't know that I was trying to stay interested in that work as much as that work wouldn't really leave me alone, even when I tried to let go of it, which is maybe a different way of thinking about it, where, two of the essays in my most recent book, the essay collection, for a long time were one massive novella-length essay that I could never seem to get around the side of. And only after I finally presented it to my writing group did they say, "That's two essays. Here's where you need to cut them." And so I guess the moral of the story is that everyone should be in a writer's group. So that they can get you out of your your sad little cycle.
So my last question is for Caroline, and it talks about the title story that Alex brought up at the beginning, The Prince of Mournful Thoughts. So The Prince of Mournful Thoughts is a fictionalized retelling and reimagining of the true story of a king who has to kill his son in order to save his dynasty. It's probably my favorite story in the entire collection. The story of the king and the prince was originally written by Lady Hong, the wife of the real prince. both your work and Lady Hong's work is interested in family and in larger questions about our humanity. So, what can this fable teach us about familial relationships, about generational differences in relation to preserving a family's history?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I love stories about monarchies because they're really stories of the distortions of family relationships. So, especially in a society like Korean society, which is really Confucian and based on these very rigid hierarchies of age and family relationships, where you are so, that the kind of respect that you give to your elders. But that's distorted if you're a king and you become a king when you're a kid, and now suddenly all of your elders have to, bow down to you. And not only bow down to you, but in Korean, there's all these different levels of language. So they have to speak to you in this super honorific terms, which, in any other family would sound outrageous. So the relationships are distorted in that way. And then also they get distorted because, it's about power, and power distorts all relationships, really. And so there's kind of like, when you're a king, that your sons are going to be the ones that replace you. So there's just always just from that relationship, there's a tension there. And I see that, kind of brought down to more intimate family relationships. It's difficult in Korean culture because, it has a strict hierarchy. But then you move to America where, supposedly we don't really have those. And so, when one part of the family has been brought up in one culture and the other half is being brought up in a different culture, this automatically going to be a clash. And so that's why I saw the story Prince Sado as really like a father-son struggle. And the son really just really wants to please his father, the way that I envision it. And the father, they just, they kind of clash from the beginning. Their personalities just don't match up. And that happens in families too. You can't really choose that. And so I just see that as a tragedy because there's so much possibility in family relationships for closeness, for support. And so when you see the lack of it, it's just really sad.
And I think in a lot of your other stories, you do see those differences, and whether it's father, son, or just those generational differences. But I think what's interesting about that fable is there is that sense of tragedy, whereas in some of your other stories, you do see the hopefulness and the joy, even though there is sort of misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, in that relationship at that time, there's just not a lot of wiggle room in the way that the king or the prince can really act. So that's where the tragedy comes in, is they're really locked in to their roles.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that's all that we have time for. I want to thank Caroline and Alex for spending some time with us. Thank you to Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures and to our bookstore sponsor, White Whale Bookstore. And the Prince of Mournful Thoughts and Other Stories is now available at your retailer of choice. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, again. Take care.